Okay, everybody, welcome back to part two of Magnolia United Church of Christ special learning session on the U.S. Constitution. So last week we covered Constitution 101. I think many of us had our heads blown with all the things that we either had never learned or needed to had a refresher on. And tonight, Greg is going to take us through the First Amendment. So, Greg, so just to clarify, so everyone will be on Zoom tonight. Do you want people to come off mute and ask questions? Do you want them to put it in chat, or do you want to wait till the end? How would you like to work this tonight? Oh, you're on mute, Greg. Oh, there you go.
Okay. I think it's better that anybody who has a question ask it whenever they have it. And I will finish my thought.
Great.
We'll go into your question. Okay?
Okay, sounds good. Let me go ahead and get it.
Marcy, who has the graphics?
I am going to be doing that. Just give us 1 second there.
All right. There's Norman.
Okay. Can you see me the graphics okay?
Yes.
Yeah, what you should see is a Norman Rockwell painting from, I imagine this was a cover on Saturday Evening Post from many years ago, and it speaks to how much the First Amendment is a cultural piece in the United States, how important it is to our culture for a variety of reasons. A fairly young, looks like a householder, fairly informed. He's got a pamphlet in his pocket, and he's obviously at a town meeting, and he stands up to give his opinion. One of the hallmarks of democracy is that everyone has a voice. That's the point of democracy, and you can't have everyone having a voice without the First Amendment. So you can't have democracy without freedom of speech. And we will get into this in a minute, but before we do, let me step back a moment and ask, has you all had a chance to look at the Constitution over the week? Does anybody want to talk about their experience in reading the Constitution in the last week? Go ahead and spit it out. What do you think? What did you learn? What did you feel? What did you experience in reading through that? Shall I pick one of you to go first?
I will.
Okay, Shirley.
Yeah, I'm still puzzled. This came up last week, but I'm still puzzled about why they were so wise to figure out that a president might be very inclined to take over too much power, and so there had to be controls built in, and the balance between the three branches and the checks and so forth. And yet they didn't apply the same kind of thinking to the Supreme Court.
Oh, good. Well, a lot of this goes back to what we talked about, both Locke and Montesquieu being students of human nature. And I believe that some of their research went all the way back to Plato in his observance of all the different types of government there was. Many thinkers had done this over the centuries. With regard to the Supreme Court, the thinking was that the court would be too busy finding the law and directing what the law was to have to be distracted by politics and by having to run again or having to make their decisions in a certain way that they became popular with a president who would appoint them again. I think in retrospect, that's probably not something most of us agree with. Any other thoughts on the Constitution before we jump in here? What was your experience like in reading this? Did you find it real easy and simple? Almost nobody does, because it wasn't written in particularly easy and simple terms. The Supreme Court, as I mentioned, has a hard time understanding it. I ran across a case today that had, among the 9 of them, they had written 7 opinions. That means almost nobody agrees with anybody else about what the Constitution meant, at least in this particular case. So if you have lots of questions, join the crowd, so does everyone else. And this is a good time to bring up any questions you might have about it before we move forward.
Greg, Sandra has her hand up.
Yeah, Sandra.
I was surprised at how detailed it was. It was incredibly detailed. And a couple of the questions I had were, I don't know, towards the beginning when it talks about the senators being elected, and it says, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of the state in which he shall be chosen. And it sounded to me like
Do you guys want to come in and just watch it from in here?
they can't live in the state they're elected in. And
Yeah, that may be a misinterpretation. I would have to take a look at that one. I think they do have to be in
well, yeah, of
the
course.
state.
I know
And
they do.
And I believe there's a section that makes it clear that the president and vice president may not be electors from the same state. And that may
Yeah.
be what you're looking at, Sandra, because, for instance, when George W. Bush drafted Dick Cheney to be his vice presidential running mate, they had a problem. They were both from Texas, and Cheney had to go up to Wyoming and re-register. So they can't be from the same state. And I think maybe that's the section that you're looking at, but we could take a look at that maybe later after the class, if you're still
Oh, it's
confused.
okay. I just wanted to mention it. It's one
Yeah.
thing that I noticed. It's in a couple places.
Yeah, we
That
should
and
look
how
at-
just incredibly detailed. I mean, they really had their stuff together. They went through, spent a lot of time figuring it
Okay.
all out.
And I see Lindsay's talking about the 12th Amendment, where right after the Constitution was in place. Lindsay, does it say what year the 12th Amendment was passed? I want to say 1803 or something like that. We had the experience with the Adams-Jefferson administration. They were from separate parties, and it didn't work out so well. Yeah, the 12th Amendment was ratified in June of 1804. So it was to repair the damage that they had inadvertently set up by by saying that the second largest vote holder in the Electoral College would become vice president. Because what we had as a result was a Federalist president with a Democratic vice president. And the two of them didn't get along too well until they were much older and began corresponding about their experiences. And so that was a remedial legislation, the 12th Amendment. Barbara, did you have a question?
Actually, there are some states where that sort of thing can still happen between the governor and the lieutenant governor.
Right. I saw that in Virginia, they run separately.
Yes, yes. And so it is possible in some states, and I don't know which ones they are, to to end up with people from different parties.
Right.
I actually I had a question about something which actually is sort of maybe in the weeds. So maybe we should return to it later, because I want to get
Okay.
And
it has to do with Article 4, Section 3, the thing about no state can be formed within a state without can be formed from another state or
Oh, right. Right. And yeah, let's pick that up when we get next week to the 14th Amendment. That's a good idea. So
okay.
in some areas, it is highly detailed, and in others, there's not much detail at all. And a lot is left for the imagination. A lot is left for the courts to work on in the future. And that's why we have so much constitutional law. So let's.
and Greg, I think Paul Gibbs might have one before you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering on that example you used about the presidents both being and vice president both being from Texas. That's such an obvious workaround to just have him move someplace else. He's still both from Texas. I mean,
Well, luckily he had dual residency. Luckily for him, he had dual residency. He had been in Congress as was his daughter many years later, from the state of Wyoming. And I think there was some sort of special arrangement made, but he was allowed to do that. Yeah. Down in Florida, there were bumper stickers a few years ago that said Trump DeSantis 2024. And that is not possible because they were both electors from the same state. Well,
Okay.
let's move forward, and Marcy, if we can move to the next slide. Gerald Early was a collaborator with Ken Burns, and he said that there's only three things America will be remembered for years and years from now, and that would be jazz music, baseball, and the U.S. Constitution, the three most beautiful things this culture has ever created. And what I would like to say is that if the height of jazz is a Charlie Parker solo, and the height of baseball is an Ohtani home run after he pitches 5 scoreless innings, the height of the U.S. Constitution is right here in the First Amendment. There are a lot of flaws in the U.S. Constitution, but the First Amendment is not one of the areas where we would point to right away and say, boy, there's a lot of things wrong with that. To the contrary, it is some of the best poetry in the Constitution. Let's move to the next slide and take a look at it. It reads almost like a poem. If you read it to yourself, as we all should have it in mind from time to time as Americans, we'll note that it's a series of rights. And does anybody want to take a stab at how many separate rights you see in the First Amendment? Go ahead. What do you think? How many separate rights are there? Lindsay says 6. Good guess. Any other ideas? Most scholars would agree there are 6. The Establishment Clause is almost a prohibition on Congress establishing a religion. Maybe that's not so much a right as it is just a prohibition of a power. But what we really have here is two religion clauses, and then there's the speech and press section, 2 more clauses that give us rights, and then 2 more dealing with assembly and petition of the government for redress of grievances. And one of the things that we mentioned last week is that the Bill of Rights represents the idea that there is a higher law than the Constitution, that the rights of man existed before they created a government or before anybody created a government. In our last lecture, we heard John Locke, the political philosopher from the late 17th century, talk about how government cannot grant us personal rights that we already own by operation of natural law. That we already own these. And he says man was born with these inalienable rights, like the right to offer one's own opinion or worship in his own manner as his conscience directs him. And so these are nothing that a government can take away because they are already ours. And when we made the government, we made it specifically with this stipulation in place. So in a way, we would read the First Amendment almost like it's the founders writing a memo to Congress, reminding them that the government has no power to take away these basic fundamental freedoms that existed before the government existed. Nothing about establishing the government changed that relationship. So there is also this very, I think, poetic idea about how these are listed. The First Amendment preserves freedoms, and their relationship to us emerges almost in a process here, if we look at it. It's part of our culture. What we talk about is we speak of freedom, we speak of living in a free country, we've got freedom of speech, and a lot of that culture comes right out of this paragraph right here. And we see in the first 2 rights the right of free exercise of a religion, and to be free from the establishment of a government religion, we see the development of an idea, almost as if there is a citizen, she's standing in front of us, and she is thinking. She is thinking about her place in the universe, her place vis-a-vis nature or God or other people. And she is exercising her own philosophy and her own conscience. If she likes the idea well enough, she might incorporate her friends. She might incorporate people into it to help refine this idea. She would speak about it. She might print something and put it out to a greater group of people, maybe go online and put it out in social media. That's the press. She's got that right to refine the idea that she enveloped in her own consciousness in the first place, and then to execute that idea, to take it downtown, as it were, to peaceably assemble before a government building, or to testify at Congress, or to write a letter to the editor, or to knock door to door to advance an idea, or to run for government, because she sees a thing that which must be changed, and she wants to petition that government for the change, for the redress of grievances. So there's almost this logical poetry that's going on in the First Amendment. This is why I think it's the most beautiful part of the Constitution, because we think about in terms of developing, refining, and executing an idea. We cannot be a creative people or a vigilant people without the ability to communicate. Both education and organization require communication. Criticism of the government requires communication. And John Locke asserted that a government that fails to protect the people fails in the one obligation that it's got to the people, and therefore becomes an illegitimate government. And that we have not only the right, but the power and the obligation to overturn illegitimate government. Well, you can't do that without the communication of ideas. And this was one of the major pushes to include this paragraph in the Bill of Rights. And then we also have this idea of diversity. The First Amendment it protects the diversity that we have in religious practice. Many of us come from religions that sprouted up at different places around the globe. And the diversity of living in a society and in a community with so many different creeds and religious practices, or none at all, or ones that we don't know of, or ones that are very individual. Religious tolerance is a part of our national psyche, our national project. And as we at this church, Magnolia UCC, know, many people come from a different religion, and they speak frequently about how it differs from what they do now. This is religious practice, the free exercise clause. And before we leave this slide, if we would look at the last four of these freedoms, speech, press, assembly, and petition, are taken together the right of protest. You can't protest without speech. You can't do it without being able to make impressions of your theory and distribute them. You can't do it without assembling, and you certainly can't do it without petitioning the government for the redress of grievances. And this is why we will see that the First Amendment becomes, in the 20th century, the protector of the highest form of speech, which is political speech. So protest is a part of the national psyche. It is protected by the last four rights in the First Amendment. I guess one of the questions we have in looking at the history of this is, what was this idea, petitioning the government for the redress of grievances? We'll first see it in the Virginia Constitution, which was established in 1776, in a little bit. If it means anything, it means being able to make ourselves known to government while we're protected in that speech, whether it's writing a letter or participating in a rally or testifying before Congress. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind is this deals with the relationship between us and our government. It does not deal with the relationship between us and other private parties. So somebody who works for, let's say, a small company, and the small company says to their employee, you're not allowed to talk about our trade secrets when you go out into public. You can't disclose a client list. You can't talk about how much money you have. And if you do that, we will fire you. That is perfectly legal because you can't plead the First Amendment as a defense to termination in a private contract. If you look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law. So what we're talking about is our relationship to the government. Later, this will become to the state governments also, but initially it was just the federal government. So if you're working for a non-government employer and you're told there's certain things you're not allowed to talk about outside the workplace because we hold those secrets precious, that probably would be upheld in a court of law. Well, let's take a look at the next slide because it's important to know that in the history of the First Amendment, speech was not always as free as it is now. Beginning in the late 1600s in England, Parliament and various publishers, newspaper editors, gained political power as the monarchy began to lose that power. We talked about last week about how institutions in the church were losing power as the individual gained power. And it wasn't until the late 1680s in England that members of parliament were even allowed to criticize the king on the floor of parliament. And they still could not do so outside of the floor of parliament until 1694 that the British government kept a lock on what could be published. Now, certainly there were bootleg publishers, but if you wanted to publish freely, you had to get a license to do it. And so there was an inbuilt censorship from the king, perhaps from parliament also, on what could be published. And individuals did not have the right to freely and publicly criticize the king or parliament when they were on the street. All of this was happening just less than 100 years before our founders drafted our own Constitution. So a lot would have to change before we get to the present state of the First Amendment. Was there a question? I think I saw something pop up. Let me go ahead. Maybe not. Okay. Let's look at the beginning of free speech in the United States at the next slide. And what we see is that there were a lot of laws that placed a damper on political speech. Even in the early 1700s, there were seditious libel cases, including Seabank Hogg, who called the New Hampshire officials a parcel of pitiful beggarly curs, and Edward Erbury, who called the Maryland Assembly a company of turdy fellows. Well, who has not wanted to shake his fist at Congress and call them a company of turdy fellows? But early in our history, the First Amendment did not have the kind of deep roots that certain other rights that are preserved in the Bill of Rights have had. Even the Second Amendment rights to bear arms go back to Henry VIII or earlier, but that is not the case with speech. Let's move forward. If we fast forward all the way up to just after the Constitution, now we're in 1788. And James Madison and his partner in crime, Alexander Hamilton, are basically writing letters of propaganda to the New York papers. They cranked out quite a few of them. They are known as the Federalist Papers. And in Madison's letter, number 45, he says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Now, who is his audience? Who do you suppose he's trying to sway? He's writing to the papers in New York because the New York ratifying convention is coming up. And Hamilton had told him, I don't think it is going to pass New York the way we sit. New York was by far the most wealthy state. They had the port, they had the river, they needed to, the nation needed New York. And they were afraid that New York was not going to join. And so they try, both of them, Madison, Hamilton, and also John Jay, who wrote a few of these letters, to point out to the people who will be ratifiers of the Constitution that the federal government is not going to be that strong. They say the federal government's powers are few and defined. And yet the state governments, the power that is closest to the people, you know these people, they're in Albany, they're in Richmond, they're in Boston. These people who run the states, they will have numerous and indefinite powers. They will concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order and prosperity of the state. This is what we call the health, safety, and welfare powers or police powers of the various states. And not everybody agreed with Madison that what he was saying in Federalist 45 was correct. But let's take a look at why they wouldn't have agreed with Madison. And the next slide is one that you've seen before. Last week, we looked at Article 1, Section 8, which is these enumerated powers of Congress. Most of the powers of Congress are in Article 1, Section 8, though there are a few sprinkled around elsewhere in the Constitution. And the idea was that Congress will be an instrument of a limited legal jurisdiction. It can't just go out and do anything it wants, like the king could do. In fact, it only had certain powers. But however, we look at the bottom of, this is page 2 of the exhibit that's in your materials for last week, and we see that the laundry list of powers Congress has ends with this idea that they can do anything necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The Congress can use or perhaps abuse what they call the necessary and proper clause to write laws on anything you want. It'd be like loaning your car to somebody, perhaps a child, and saying you can only go to the grocery store and the pharmacy, come back home after that, unless you see anything else that's necessary and proper that you might want to do, which basically is an open-ended blank check to take the car wherever the heck they want. And that's kind of what scared some of the ratifiers. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll see that Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry is the same Patrick Henry that we saw back in 1775, yelling, "Give me liberty or give me death." And here he is in 1788, 13 years later. He is a Virginian, and he is a very loud voice at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He's very well known in the state of Virginia, and he's saying, not that kind of liberty. Give me liberty or give me death, but I don't like this liberty. This idea of Patrick Henry's, was that the necessary and proper clause gave Congress such an exception, such a blank check, that without a guarantee from the ratifiers, from the founders, rather, of the Constitution, that Congress must stop somewhere and could not invade our personal liberties, the scope of our personal rights, that it would do so by encroaching on these rights. And what he said is, if Congress were to encroach on this right and you plead, hey, wait a minute, there was an implication. Didn't the founders imply that we were still going to retain all of these rights? He says, you will lose, for they will be justified in the last part of it, meaning the last part of Article 1, Section 8, which gives them, meaning Congress, full power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out their power into execution. Well, suddenly, Patrick Henry comes up against, who else do you suppose is at the Virginia Ratifying Conference? James Madison, who you already know as the father of the Constitution. Madison and Henry are both Virginians. Henry is an anti-federalist. He does not want the Constitution to go into effect. There were also the Federalists like Hamilton and John Adams, who were in favor of, obviously, a strong central government. And then there were the Democrats, like Jefferson and Madison, who wanted the central government to have powers, but they maybe did not think that the central government should be quite as powerful as what Hamilton thought they should be. And this is where Madison finally understands that he's going to have to go back to Congress and ask for a Bill of Rights. Without the Bill of Rights, this proposed constitution is not going to pass, or at least it's not going to pass in Virginia, which he was very concerned about and was a very populous state. Well, it happened at the Virginia Ratification Conference that Virginia had an opportunity to become the ninth state. Now, the ninth state is important because Article 7 of the Constitution says when the ninth state ratifies the Constitution, we will have a country. There will be 9 states, and among those 9 states, we will share a central government. During the ratifying conference, there were 8 states that had accepted the Constitution, and Virginia had an opportunity to become the ninth. They got entangled in this debate, and it dragged on quite a few days. And what happened was that Madison agrees to go back to Congress and push through the Bill of Rights. But by the time Virginia takes a vote, USA has already a country because New Hampshire has become the ninth state to ratify the proposed Constitution just 4 days earlier. Virginia joins very quickly thereafter to be the 10th state, and then very quickly we'll see New York and the rest of them fall in line. Let's move to the next slide. So where did, and I don't know if you can expand that at all, where did Madison get his ideas for the First Amendment? Well, very clearly they come from the Constitution of Virginia, which had been in place since 1776. And if you read through here, you will recognize a lot of it. Freedoms of speech and press are the bulwarks of liberty. And then if you look further, you'll see here is the verbiage almost verbatim that makes it into the First Amendment. Madison adds to it, obviously, the clauses about religion. Well, was Patrick right? Was Patrick Henry right that if given an opportunity, the government would right away fill the void and try to take away the rights of individuals to a free political environment, freedom of speech in the political arena? Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and even the one after that, we might come back to this one. Okay, I've left one out, but let's go back, if you would, Marcy, to the one before, which is the First Amendment. What happened was that even with the First Amendment in place, which became law in 1791 after, again, it goes through a ratification process, and these first 10 amendments become the Bill of Rights, become the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Even with that in place, Congress passes a thing called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which tries to insulate Congress from criticism in public. And it was wildly unpopular. So unpopular that it cost John Adams a second term as president. He signed the law. He even got some amendments to it that watered it down. He said he was against it, but he signed it anyway. And it became a very unpopular part of his 4-year administration. He would lose the election of 1800 to Jefferson, and most historians would agree that signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which prohibited certain types of criticism of Congress, was a primary reason that he didn't prevail. Mostly, the Alien and Sedition Acts were aimed at editors, newspaper editors, and there were several of them arrested. It was just a lot of juries would not find guilty, would not return a verdict in favor of the state, and it did. And I believe it was during the Jefferson administration that they were repealed. All right, now we can move forward. Marcy, thank you. And we'll fast forward all the way up into the second half of the 20th century and take a look at where political speech got its strength. Where did it really pick up wind in its sails? And a lot of it happened in cases that involved universities. Sweezy was a guy who taught at the University of New Hampshire. He, I believe, was a communist. This was during the Red Scare. New Hampshire said that they wanted to see his notes from his lectures on economics at the University of New Hampshire. He refused. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the court said that it is the business of the university to provide an atmosphere most conducive to speculation, experimentation, and creation, and that there are 4 essential freedoms of a university. It will decide on its own who may teach, what can be taught, how it shall be taught, and who will be admitted to study. And what the Supreme Court was finding, in this case, it was a concurrence by Justice Frankfurter, was that the university was such an important place for the development and exercise of ideas that they had to make clear that faculty members were not subject to tests of their own patriotism or their willingness to repeat a certain dogma. This is called viewpoint or perspective, and the viewpoint perspective of faculty is one of the most sacrosanct types of speech there is. It is often political speech. And we go through, there's a lot of rich language here about what university faculty do. They have the right to examine, question, modify, and even throw out entire bodies of accepted belief and start with a new paradigm. That's what Frankfurter is talking about. And in the university, at least, early on, we saw political speech grow to the point where it was considered probably one of the most, probably the place with the most amount of freedom of speech. And let's move forward just a few years, Marcy, to the next really important speech case was had to do with defamation, and in particular, the New York Times. Very briefly, what happened is the New York Times published a large advertisement, and the advertisement criticized some public officials in the South who found that there were actual errors in this advertisement, and they sued the New York Times, and the New York Times said, wait a minute, we have First Amendment rights. We can print whatever we want. The plaintiff said, well, no, not when it's wrong. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1964, in probably the most important free speech case of the last 100 years, Justice Brennan, who writes most of these free speech cases, came out saying that what we publish has to live in an environment that is wide open, caustic, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes there'll even be hateful attacks on government and public officials, but that political speech, the unfettered exercise of political speech, is the central meaning of the First Amendment. So you can see over these few cases, mid-century, in the last century, how the First Amendment was becoming a very strong political tool. And in particular, whenever the speech was based in politics, it was political speech, it gathered even more protection. And it's important for us to look at what the limits on free speech are, because there are some. Let's move forward to that slide. So there are limits to free speech. You all heard in grade school that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, you can't yell defamation things. Now, defamation, when it is a public official, is wide open. You can say whatever you want about somebody who is well known to the public, but you might not have such a successful outcome if you were to say something that you know is untrue about your neighbor, who's just another anonymous person. Libel and slander are an exception to free speech. So is incitement to imminent lawless action, or speech that threatens bodily harm, or which causes an immediate breach of the peace, which is a clear and present danger. Obviously, obscenity and child pornography in particular is an exception to the free speech law. Fraud, and there are all kinds of frauds, mail fraud, insurance fraud, business fraud, anytime that an individual induces through a known misstatement, through a known lie, induces another to enter into a contract which benefits the speaker, that could be seen as fraud. That's an intentional tort. Lying under oath, you can't go to court, get up on the stand, take the oath to tell the truth, and then lie and then fall back on the First Amendment. You can't. That's perjury. That's a crime. And then we have to look at this exception, government speech. The government can determine the content of its employees' speech just like a private employer can, and prohibit the expression of certain viewpoints. A policeman doesn't have the right to come back to the office and say, yeah, I didn't read that one guy his Miranda rights. I don't like Miranda. That's not police work. That's not policing. You can't have an assistant mayor run out to the press and talk about, you know, what a so-and-so the mayor is. Government speech does guard against the statement of certain things that are harmful to the government, such as not giving a Miranda warning. So governments can regulate the speech of their employees. And this is where we get the flip side of that argument about faculties having the right to say whatever they want on their areas of expertise. There are some state legislatures, Florida in particular, and also Texas, who are trying to control their faculties by saying what theories that they can teach and what they can't. Texas A&M just went through this, and they're still going through it. Even today, I saw a headline. It goes right back to this idea of government speech. There's some cases that are pending in the circuit courts right now that are being watched closely on what will remain after various state legislatures attack their faculties at state universities and try to get them to simply repeat what the state party line is. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Oh, and by the way, I should point out before we do this Fifth Amendment exception, that there is no such thing as a legal definition for hate speech. If a government were to say, we're going to crack down on hate speech, what they are often saying is, we're going to crack down on any speech that's against us. And you may have heard a certain member of the cabinet recently, well, she happens to be the attorney general, saying, if you engage in hate speech, we're going to come after you. That is nothing, in my opinion, but an excuse to try to sanction criticism of their own actions. Let's move forward. Now that we know that you have a right to speak, do you also have a right to remain silent? Well, absolutely you do. When you take the Fifth Amendment, that is the right to go to your own criminal case, the trial, and not take the stand. And the right to remain silent is here in the Fifth Amendment, where it says that a person shall not be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That applies from the moment that person is stopped by let's say, a police officer in a traffic stop, all the way to the point where he goes through trial and maybe is found guilty and sentenced to some sort of fine or prison time. The right to remain silent, which we call taking the fifth, applies to criminal legal procedures from the very beginning to the very end. So we have a right to speak and a right not to speak. Let's move forward. Many different acts are also viewed as speech. And let me tell you a little bit about Greg Johnson, who in 1984 in Dallas was protesting against the renomination of Ronald Reagan as the Republican nominee for president. And in doing so, what Johnson did was cut down a flag that was flying in front of a state office, pour kerosene on it, light it, and burn it. He didn't say a thing. There was no speech. But when this case goes, and he was cited for breaching a breach of the peace, there were two interests that the state of Texas said that they had in preventing flag burning. The two interests were, first of all, they wanted to preserve the flag as a symbol of national unity. If you see this at the top of the exhibit here above the three flags. The first purpose they had in preventing flag burning was to prevent the flag from being desecrated because it was a symbol of national unity, and the other one was preventing breaches of the peace. Well, even the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals here said that's an unconstitutional application of our law, and that statute cannot survive. Because the First Amendment literally forbids the abridgment of speech, but the Supreme Court had long recognized that protection doesn't end just at the spoken word or the written word. It can also be an act. Let's go to the next slide. Because what the court said was the principal function of free speech under our system is to invite dispute. It may indeed be best serve a high purpose, that the dispute itself, if it induces a condition of unrest or creates dissatisfaction, because from that we get debate. From anger, from discomfort is where we get debate about how to move forward from our present situation. And midway through the next paragraph, we note that here it's again Justice Brennan saying that what may be orthodox in politics is not anything that we can force somebody else to repeat. You can't force citizens to confess by word or act of faith their agreement to a certain dogma or religion. So let's move to the next slide, and we'll see a couple of quotes here from Brennan, which tells us just how strong this idea of political speech is. In the same case, he says, if there's a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it's that the government can't prohibit the expression of an idea simply because they don't like it, or because society finds the idea offensive or disagreeable. A lot of people found the idea of burning a flag offensive or agreeable, but that is not in and of itself a crime. And we go back to a statement he made 20 years earlier, that all ideas having even the most slight redeeming social importance, even including unorthodox and controversial ideas, even hateful ideas to a prevailing climate of opinion, have protection under the guarantees of the First Amendment. So this is how big and how broad the First Amendment is. It is the bedrock of our cultural identity in the United States, both the speech and press as well as the religion and the protest phrases of the First Amendment. And there are some other protected acts which we should know about. One was a case that came out of Colorado where a motorist flashed his lights at an oncoming motorist to warn that oncoming motorist that there was a police officer parked down the road. And, you do that. You say to some other motorist, totally anonymous party to you, hey, there's a cop, you might want to slow down. Well, guess who saw the lights flashing? The cop. And the cop arrested not the speeder, but the guy who had flashed his lights to the speeder. And the result of that case was that it was dismissed by the trial court because flashing your lights is an act of free speech. Well, let's take a look at another part of the First Amendment while we still have some time. And that is this part, which is on the next slide. It is the separation of these two streets and avenues, church and state. What we find if we look back historically is that as early as 1530, Martin Luther was working on separating church and state. And where did he find his authority? Well, it being Martin Luther, he found his authority in the Bible. And in particular from the words, and Marcy, you can correct me, but I think this is in the Gospels, and it's ascribed to Jesus himself, who said, give unto God what is God and give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And that's where Martin Luther began to say, the church and state should not be the same body. 1530 was a time when the church and state were very, very closely married together. And one of the objections at the time was this idea that if somebody sinned against God, does that mean that he also has repudiated the king? And if he does something disagreeable to the king, does that mean he's also sinned against God? Well, if church and state are in the same pocket, in the body of the same person, then yes, it would be. But Martin Luther says this is not how society should be. Church and state should be separate. And he is one of the first thinkers who writes that into some of his philosophy. Let's move forward to the next slide, and we'll see again now the words of the First Amendment where they talk about two different ideas here. These are two very different ideas about religion. The second one, that we have the right to exercise our own religion, will have some limits on it too, and we'll see that in a minute. The first one is that Congress shall not establish a church. There is no, and there has never been in the United States, any federal religion. But let's look at the next slide because it does point to some interesting histories. And that is that the states all at one point did have state religions. And you'll see that the Anglicans occupied most of the mid-Atlantic states. And then also there were smatterings of Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Roman Catholics, and I think there are 4 or 5 Jewish congregations that are listed on this map. And our predecessors, the Congregational Church, which existed primarily, as you see on the map, in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and other places in New England. The states did preference one or the other churches by oftentimes nominating the bishop, by giving tax breaks to that church, and by benefiting it in other ways, such as state donations and support to, for instance, paying the salaries of certain parsons. That would go away, and it would go away almost on its own accord. Now, if you note, the language of the First Amendment says that Congress will establish no religion. So until the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about next week, the First Amendment doesn't specifically apply to the states establishing their own religions, which they all did to some extent, but they were moving away from that at about the time of the Constitution. And let's go to the next slide, and we'll see that before the U.S. Constitution, all 13 states had ties to different churches. Finally, Thomas Jefferson would coin the term the wall of separation between church and state. And there was a big movement among Jeffersonians and others to move the states away from preferring one church over the other. By 1833, they had all moved beyond that. And in 1868, it would have become illegal. But many of the states, even in, well, I think it was actually Illinois until 1833 that still had a relationship with the church. Madison was very strongly against this. And when a bill came to him during his presidency to appoint the bishops of, I believe it was the Anglican Church, he said, no, we have nothing to do with this. We are not signing this law. Congress will not be appointing any bishops to anything. Let's move forward to the next. Go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
How did Congress, or I guess it was probably during the creation of income tax, and when it was debated as to whether or not churches should receive tax exempt status, I mean, that seems to fly in the face of separation of church and state to me.
Interesting take. And the answer is, I don't know. If you look at Article 1, Section 8, the very first thing that Congress has the power to do is to tax. And then one of the amendments, it's going to come along, I believe, in the early 1920s, that allowed for a federal income tax, does allow the income tax against individuals. I was wondering about this idea too, actually, at one point not long ago. Like, where did we get the idea that churches would not be taxed? It is in federal law in the Constitution. And the answer to your question, how is that not a preference, is that it prefers all churches similarly. So even though one church or one temple it gets that preference that the government is now giving it because it's a church, it doesn't get it exclusively because all the other churches and temples and various other iterations of religion get the same thing. So it isn't preferring one church over the other. So we get to this idea of the history of separation of church and state. And I would note just these two quotes. One is from Madison in 1822, long after his presidency. He's now retired and he's philosophizing. And one from Adams during his presidency. It's very brief. Adams says the government of the U.S. is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion any more than it's a Jewish or an Islam nation. So that we do not have a Christian nation. Madison's letter goes a little bit deeper. He says, and what he's saying is both churches and governments are better off without the other. A church is on equal footing when it is not hampered by government, and governments will do better without churches having anything to do with them. Okay, Marcy, we can go to the next. So the Establishment Clause is government, including state governments, from having a church. And we see that Establishment Clause cases are notoriously difficult. It is very hard for a legal scholar to say, here's the law on establishment. It is very much dependent on the facts, and the facts change. It is also dependent, in my opinion, on who is on the Supreme Court. We had a very progressive court in 1962, and in the Engel case, what the court said was that the government of New York had no business composing official prayers for any group of people to recite as a part of any religious program, even though it was possible for students to opt out of doing a non-denominational prayer in school every morning. And they struck down New York's practice of giving a prayer, even a non-denominational prayer, in school in the morning. They simply said there should be no religion, no prayer in school. This is where we get this very controversial idea that some people are against, that prayer should not be banned in school. It comes from the Engel case in 1962. But then 60 years later, in a case that comes from the state of Washington, the school district of Bremerton hired an assistant football coach who was only there a couple of years. But he had the habit of offering post-game prayers on the 50-yard line that eventually were attracting the players, even players from the opposite team, people from all over town, the cheerleaders, everybody was meeting in the middle of the 50-yard line. Bremerton School District believed that this violated their obligation to maintain the separation clause, the Establishment Clause, and separate church and state. They fired the guy after warning him not to do it, and he goes all the way to the Supreme Court with this case, and he wins. In this case, the Supreme Court said, well, people could opt out, and they were not being held in a classroom the way in the Engel case in 1962 folks were. They didn't even have to show up at the 50-yard line. And so we're going to allow this type of prayer. These are muddy cases. It is very hard to reconcile some of the results that we see in cases. I look at these two cases, I think they're almost identical. The difference is that the court in 2022 was far more conservative than the one in 1962. Let's move to the next slide and we'll go ahead and wrap this up because it's 8 o'clock. The free exercise clause bumps up against its own limits when there is already an established law which prohibits that thing that the church wants to be able to do. In the Latter-day Saints versus United States of America, all the way back in 1890, the church took laws against polygamy, both in Utah and in federal government, to court. And the Supreme Court said these longstanding laws against polygamy are applied universally. They are equally applied across government, no matter where you are. And therefore, the LDS cannot argue that it has the right to break the law in not prohibit, in fact, in promoting polygamy in church just because it's part of a church. The same result in 1990, 100 years later, in the Oregon v. Smith case. Smith was a long-term member of an Indian religion, a Native American religion that used peyote and had been doing so for decades. But there had also been laws against the use of peyote in Oregon and elsewhere. And even though he said, hey, this is part of my religion, I ought to be able to do it. And you, the state of Oregon, is prohibiting the free exercise of my religion. The Supreme Court said, no, that is an old law that is of general application, and you don't get to use peyote in your church simply because your great ancestors did. Now, this particular case was very controversial and led to a whole lot of remedial legislation from Congress, which the Supreme Court then struck down and said, nope, it's still unconstitutional. However, in a different kind of case, we got a different kind of result. This is Lukumi Babalu I versus the city of Hialeah, and you can actually get a law degree just by being able to pronounce the name of this case. In the late 1980s, the city of Hialeah, Florida, got word that a Caribbean religion was moving to its town. They were going to build a temple. There was a courtyard next to the temple where there would be sacrifices of animals, including goats and chickens and various other animals. There would then be a barbecue. And after the sacrifice, which was religious, the temple would share their food with not only the people in the church, but the folks who wanted to come around from town. The Hialeah City Council mobilized very quickly and passed an ordinance which made it that prohibited the practice of animal sacrifice inside the town. The church took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says animal sacrifice ordinance was an unconstitutional mechanism specifically to oppress a religion or its practice in this particular case. So there's always a question of how high a wall there's going to be between the separation of church and state. And these religion cases come down on the facts, and they will sometimes yield different answers depending on the different facts in each case. I think we've got another slide, don't we, Marcy, or are we at the end? Oh, yes. What about these 10 Commandment cases? There's a whole bunch of them. And as you know, certain state legislatures have either allowed or, in fact, even mandated the display of the 10 Commandments in public school classroom. All the way back in 1980, the Supreme Court said that this Kentucky law, which required the commandments be posted in public school classrooms, violated the Establishment Clause because there was absolutely nothing in that law which wasn't religious in nature, a secular purpose, and therefore it did not belong in a classroom. Well, we move forward to 2025, and the Supreme Court, and I'm sorry, this was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Intermediate Appellate Court, which, by the way, is well recognized as the most conservative of the 13 intermediate appellate courts. If you ask 100 constitutional scholars which one's the most conservative, 90 of them will say the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit, even them, said that the Louisiana law, which was recently passed, was recently in the news, this was earlier this year, required 10 Commandments displayed, the 10 Commandments be displayed in classrooms. That law was unconstitutional. And it goes back to the Stone case, and it says, where we find this type of law, it's a religious display, it's not government speech, and it violates the Establishment Clause. And then the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is also in the South, upheld a ruling that said that these large granite displays of the Ten Commandments in the Alabama courthouse violated the Establishment Clause. But however, if we go to our last slide real quickly, we'll see that there is one case that found the Ten Commandment display was constitutional. And this was a Texas case. It came out of a display on the Texas State Capitol, which was part of a historical rather than a purely religious cultural exhibit. There were 21 other historical markers and 17 monuments in the public park, giving it a broader historical context. The fact that the Ten Commandments was there did not offend the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And I guess the reason that maybe one of the takeaways from all of these cases that I presented to you about the First Amendment religious cases is that they rise and fall on the facts. A lot of state legislatures push a law just to see what they can get the Supreme Court to agree that they should be able to do. And they become political. They become political because they believe that that's going to get votes, to be honest with you. The Supreme Court has mostly held the line on things which are purely religious and not allowed the state legislatures or the federal government at any time to display any sort of religious favoring. So there is a 1 hour quick rundown on at least speech, press, religion, both the Establishment and the Free Exercise Clause, as well as assembly and petition. Those 6 rights that we hold most dear, that they are encapsulated in our first very poetic section of the Bill of Rights. And I'll take any questions you have for as long as you want to ask them. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is Chris.
Yeah, Chris.
What I don't get how political figures in office can tell all the lies they want and never get called out on it.
Well, political speech is free speech. I think that's the point, and you've hit the nail on the head about why free speech in the First Amendment context can be both a good and a bad thing. In the Sullivan case, which is the New York Times defamation case in the early 60s, what the Supreme Court said is that sometimes people make errors. Sometimes they say stuff that isn't true. Politicians need to be taken with a grain of salt by the body politic. We're used to this. But what the Supreme Court said we're not going to do is sanction statements that are made in the political arena as being something you can sue them for, because the publisher has the First Amendment right to publish matters that are controversial. Because as long as they can find one person who says this is true, then what we have is a debate instead of a clear-cut statement of what is and is not true. The idea is to foster debate, even among unpopular opinions.
Well, I've got a lot of debate in me I've been doing.
That's the goal of the First Amendment. Go ahead.
I have a question. Is it ever possible for the people representing the government, be it the president or whoever, to be seen as speaking for the government and not for it not to be political speech? In other words, you're speaking for the people.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand.
Because otherwise we can never assume that anything the government is saying to us is truthful. If we
Don't
see
we?
it all as political speech, then we can never have any trust in anything that a governmental official says.
Well, the goal of the First Amendment was not to promote truth. It was to promote free exercise of opinion and emotion.
Do you have any trust in the current government, anything they say? Shirley?
or
No.
are born into this culture where we know that our First Amendment rights naturally give us the right to say what we want to say and allow others to determine whether they agree with us. There is not a search for truth in the First Amendment. There's a search for truth in the editorial pages and the news pages of your favorite newspaper, the one you trust the most. I think that's why we trust certain news outlets, whoever they are, because it gives us that guarantee, or at least that implication, that what they're writing is well researched and documented before they write it. But that's not the job of the First Amendment. That's the job of the free press, which the First Amendment enables, and the job of the individual to decide for herself what to believe and who to follow in the press.
And what about when they encroach upon another aspect? In other words, if they're charged with preserve and protect, they're not doing that when they lie to you.
I'm sorry, give me that again.
Well, give someone else another chance. I just, the whole thing about preserve and protect seems to go by the wayside.
Oh, well, there's an interesting question. If Locke talked about how government is only valid and legitimate if it's protecting individuals, where do we see that in the Constitution? Nowhere. It's not there. And it's not there because the writers of the Constitution determined not to include these sort of lofty ideas about whether protection was a power that we expected from government. To the contrary, that's why we have elections. When you listen to a candidate, what she is saying is, I will protect you more than that guy is. I will protect you from things that guy isn't. So I think the role that a lot of us are thinking about here, which we're assigning to the First Amendment, is actually really assigned to Article 1, where it talks about elections of Congress, and Article 2, which talks about elections of the presidency. The First Amendment is not a guard against mistruths. That's our role, is to believe what we believe because we believe it is more true than something else. And that's why critical thinking is so important, but it's not in the Constitution either.
Mhm.
Who else? What else? Any other ideas for discussion or questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how under God got into the Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, the Pledge of Allegiance is not a government statement. It's not in the Constitution. The Pledge of Allegiance, it's my understanding, this may be apocryphal, but it's my understanding that it was originally in an advertisement for a flag company that came out in the, I don't know, 30s or 40s. And the
Wow.
Pledge of Allegiance was adapted by various states. Pledge of Allegiance is nothing that is required by the Constitution. It's mostly
I remember
required
when
by
they
state.
added that under God statement. It was in the 50s, I think, or 60s, because I was in school and that, of course, just they changed something which made a lot of impression on all the kids that had to say it every morning.
Grade school, Mary Lee.
Grade school, was that?
We were in grade school. I remember it too. It
Yeah.
really was upsetting to me.
Good, interesting. I used to be an elected member of my town council, and we would have to say that thing, gosh, at the beginning of every meeting for 14 years. But I never said the under God part. Not that I don't believe in God. I just don't believe that in God should belong in a Pledge of Allegiance to a flag or a constitution or a government or even a city. So you're free not to say that part, even if you're in grade school.
Well, it just kind of brings the whole Pledge of Allegiance into question. You know,
It does, doesn't
if
it?
we got it from an advertisement, it's crazy.
That's what I think. Yeah. You might want to check me on that history, but it's not part of any federal law that it's required to be said. And it it would fall under, I believe it is Section 4 of Article 6, says there's no religious test for political office. You can't be examined as to what religion you belong to take any job, whether it's the presidency all the way down to somebody who's, a line worker at a school or something. There is no religious test for political office.
I think
Great.
So
it's
you don't have to
interesting.
say under God.
Our
Sorry?
women voters meeting, they're talking about starting all the meetings with land acknowledgement. That seems to be the new Pledge of Allegiance in Seattle anyway, is a land acknowledgement.
Acknowledging who were the natives who owned the land before
Yeah.
the Europeans. That's very good. Yeah. Okay, any last couple of questions before we sign off? What I'd like you to do before next week is go back to your constitutions again, read the Bill of Rights again. It's very brief. It's 10 parts. Read it again carefully and look at all the things that must have been considered natural law, these rights that we had before the Constitution existed, that are encased in the 10 amendments to the first amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The right to speedy trial is in there, the right to counsel, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, which, by the way, goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. There are 3 jury trial rights in there. Take a look at them, and take a look in particular at the 9th and 10th Amendments. Now, the 9th Amendment reserves unenumerated freedoms to the people or the states. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we start talking about the 14th Amendment and all the things that arose from the 14th Amendment. And then I'd also like you to skip forward and read the 14th Amendment. In fact, there are 3 Reconstruction amendments, 3 amendments that happen after the Civil War. 1865, we get the abolition of slavery. 1868, we get the 14th Amendment that we're going to talk about, due process, equal protection, birthright citizenship. And in 1870, we get the right to vote of all men, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude, meaning slavery. These were known as the Reconstruction Amendments, and taken together, these 3 will be the second founding of the United States. It becomes a new constitution because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, by the way, when you get to the 14th Amendment, you'll see there's like 5 sections to it. For our purposes, don't worry about sections 2 through 5. There's some important stuff in there, but we're not going to be able to cover it next week. We'll cover the 14th Amendment, Section 1, in particular, due process, equal protection, and birthright citizenship. And we'll glancingly take a look at the 13th and 15th, abolishing slavery and providing the vote. The 14th Amendment will become the most important, this 3 taken together, but in particular, the 14th Amendment will become the most important parts of the post-Bill of Rights Constitution. And there is a key to why the 14th Amendment totally changes the U.S. Constitution. And I'll tell you what it is when we start our class next week. Any questions?
I have a question. This
Yeah.
is Barb. Was the Bill of Rights ratified as a whole? In other words, were all 10 of them ratified together?
Yeah, it's an interesting history. There actually were 12 that went before, I believe the Congress turned out 12 rights.
Yes.
And 2 of them did not pass the number of states that were necessary to ratify them and make them part of the Constitution. This beautiful First Amendment, which we hold dear as like the first thing that's in the Bill of Rights, actually was the Third Amendment. The first one was something very inconsequential, which ironically is now the 27th Amendment. It says that
Yeah.
somebody who's elected to office doesn't get to vote on his own raise. Something that's fairly, unimportant compared to freedom of speech. The First Amendment is where it should be, in where it lies in the Constitution, because a couple of the others that Madison proposed did not pass the test with the states.
So they were actually, the state legislatures took them up 1 through 12 and voted up or down. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right, because if you'll go take a look at Article 5 of the US Constitution, it says that in order for an amendment to become part of the Constitution, 2/3 of both houses have to approve it, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures.
Right.
They didn't get 3/4 of the state legislatures at the time for 2 of them. So
It's
yeah,
also-
they did come as a group. They did all come in at the very same time, which was December of 1991 and 1791.
91.
Greg, I'm gonna stop us here and call us for the evening, out of respect for your time as well.
Thank
And
you.
make sure everybody knows we have one more session to go, like Greg talked about for the homework for next week. It will be the exact same Zoom number. So please join us for one more time next Thursday, 7 p.m., same Zoom number. We will be right back here. And thank you, Greg, so much for tonight. That was wonderful.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you.
tuning in.
Bye.
Take care,
Bye.
y'all.
Night, everyone.
See you next
Bye.
week.